Okay, so let's start again on the issue of the similarities and differences of Buddhism and science. I've said something about that yesterday when I was doing the talk called What is Science? But here I want to be more precise. One thing is a little bit surprising when you hear in dialogues between Buddhists and scientists is what I call the tendency to hegemony. I will allude to that later. Namely, for instance, in the extreme, some scientists would like to reduce Buddhism to a system of discourses and beliefs that justify a certain practice of brain modifications, of brain plasticity. So they want to take Buddhism as an object of science. So this is the tendency of hegemony that comes from science and tries to capture Buddhism in its own system of representations and concepts. On the other side, I hope there are not so many people who do that, but some would like, maybe some Buddhists, I don't know, would like to say, okay, for instance, science was already there in Buddhism. Quantum physics was already invented by Buddhism. Okay? But this is not true. Even though I've shown so many connections between the two, there is no such thing as quantum physics as a working system of symbols for prediction of phenomena and technological improvement that is to be found in Buddhism. So quantum physics and Buddhism have a common point, a very important common point, but they are not identical. One should not be so naive as to say, oh, quantum physics was already in Buddhism. It's not true, okay? So these are the two tendencies to hegemony. Science wants to capture Buddhism. Buddhism wants to capture science. I think things are a little bit more interesting, in fact, and complicated. There are similarities of methods. There are many differences also in directions of research, and yet the two disciplines can have a very beneficial contact with each other. They can collaborate because, and you will see how, because one can afford let me come to the matter. You will see that all these things will unfold. Okay, what are the similarities now between Buddhism and science? In some way, both of them are forms of knowledge based on empirical observations. And also, both disciplines seek intersubjective agreement about the outcomes of knowledge by way of shared rational principles. So, observation and reason are common. It's very clear. For instance, the critical aspect of Buddhism is often illustrated by this saying of the Buddha, probably in some sutras. Just like examining gold in order to know its quality, you should put my word to the test. A wise person doesn't accept them out of respect. Okay, so it's clear that you have to do the experiments by yourself in order to enter into a system of thought and also a system of life that was advocated and expounded by the Buddha. Also, you know, in the West, there is a discipline called epistemology, namely the theory of knowledge. And the theory of knowledge, namely epistemology, is very much developed also in Buddhist philosophy. I must say, this is the way I entered into Buddhism. I was struck by the accuracy of the analysis of knowledge by Buddhist writers, such as Dinaga, Dharmakirti, and many others. And for instance, Buddhist epistemology makes an analysis of pramana, namely the ways of right knowledge. And you know that there are many pramanas. The first one, which is privileged, is perceptual awareness, perception. However, so according to Dharmakirti, perception is really the primary source, the one that is most faithful, and the one that has to be paid attention on. Yet, perception always comes with reasoning, and reasoning can be useful in order to go beyond perception. For instance, there are things that cannot be reached by mere perception, but can be reached indirectly by making inferences from one perception to another. So it's the case, you know, this is a famous case that you discuss in Buddhist philosophy classes, namely when you see smoke, you infer fire. Okay, so this is very simple example of how perception alone is not sufficient. Perception plus inference can bring you much more knowledge. But of course, inference is less certain than perception. It has to be criticized also, because there can be a case in which you have smoke without fire. It exists. It's, you know, smoke can be produced by other means than fire. Okay. In the same way, science, in fact, the very concept of science in the West was invented by Aristotle. You can see the famous Organon of Aristotle. It's a book of logic, but also of theory of knowledge. The two come together, just as much as in Buddhism, actually. Logic and epistemology come together. So, according to Aristotle, scientific knowledge is acquired by applying a mode of logical inference called the syllogism. Syllogism, for instance, I was quoting the most famous example of syllogism in Aristotle, namely, all men are mortal, and Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Okay, so you have a general proposition, all men are mortal. You have a particular proposition connecting one individual to a concept. Socrates, the individual, is connected to the concept human. Then you derive from the general proposition about human a particular proposition about Socrates. Socrates is mortal. Here is the kind of deduction that is used in Aristotle's logic. But in order to derive such conclusions, you have to start from premises that Aristotle say are primary, immediate, better known than and prior to the conclusion. So the premise must be clearly known, obviously known. Okay? Now, what is this kind of premise that is primary, immediate, and better known than the conclusion? What is that? It can be two things, and this is, you know, this is a similarity and a difference with Buddhism. The prior can be perception, just as much as in Dharmakirti. Perception allows you to derive a conclusion by inference. But the prior can be also a first principle. What is a first principle? Okay, it can be the principle of non-contradiction, or the principle of the excluded third. You know that, maybe. I hope you know that. Because this is very Buddhist, actually. The principle of contradiction says that it's not true that you can say something and the contrary of something at the same time. It's impossible. That it would be contradictory. And the principle of the third, excluded third, said that it's either A or non-A, but there is no third possibility. This is not, well, in Buddhism, in Buddhist logic, things are a little bit more subtle than that. But here is the kind of first principle from which you could start a reasoning. And according to Aristotle, first principles are just as obvious as perceptions. And I think here Aristotle was very much impressed, as Plato was, by mathematics. Mathematics works this way. You posit first principles, very general, entirely general, nothing about individual perceptions, and then you derive other conclusions that are just as general as a premise. And this derivation from general propositions to general propositions, as in mathematics, is something, here I confess my ignorance, I'm not sure there is something similar in Buddhist logic, but I ask you. You'll tell me after. Okay, these are similarities of Buddhism and science, isn't it? Okay, now I've seen some similarities and maybe some nuances between science and Buddhism. Now I want to see some complementarities. Okay, it's not differences yet. I will speak of differences later, but complementarities. How can science contribute to Buddhism, and how can Buddhism contribute to science? How can science contribute to maybe the knowledge of Buddhism? And you all know that there are objective scientific studies of the biological correlates of meditation, namely neural correlates, modifications of the brain under meditation, or hormonal correlates of meditation. For instance, you can have some hormones that are raised by meditation, oxytocin, say. Also, immunity can be enhanced by the practice of meditation. Genetic modifications can be triggered by certain practices of meditation. For instance, Alan Wallace has worked with Clifford Saron and has shown that there is a modification of the enzyme that repairs chromosomes and DNA when people meditate for 3 months, at least in certain cases. So clearly there is an application of science to the knowledge of the effects of the practice that is done in Buddhism. Also, what is very important, especially to His Holiness, is that science can contribute to the ethical aim of Buddhism, namely the ethical aim of alleviating suffering. For instance, when psychologists use meditation for therapeutic purposes, they apply certain methods of science to the enhancement of certain precise applications of meditation. So here, of course, you could say this is mutual benefit. It's not only benefit of science to Buddhism, but it's also benefit of Buddhism to science and especially medicine. Also, science can help to locate Buddhism in a modern cultural context, because I know that some authors, some Buddhist authors of the 1930s were a little bit worried. They say, okay, we have our old tradition on the one side, and you have these modern trends of culture that are favored by science. And how can we connect the two? How can we locate Buddhism in this new world that is produced by science? So I think that the meeting of Buddhism and science has to address these kind of issues. Also, there are benefits, specific benefits of Buddhism for science. And the first one who really noticed that was Francisco Varela. Francisco Varela, whose book Embodied Mind is really full of considerations about the way Buddhism improves the understanding of cognitive science. Okay? And here is a sentence you can read in his book Embodied Mind. According to Varela, the rediscovery of Asian philosophy, particularly of Buddhist traditions, is a second renaissance in the cultural history of the West. Now, Renaissance was a time in which people rediscovered ancient knowledge that was completely lost in Europe during the Middle Ages. And suddenly, the rediscovery of this ancient knowledge completely changed the course of the history of Europe. And precisely, it was because of this rediscovery of ancient texts that science was born. So, according to Varela, the same thing could happen to the world as a whole as a result of the discovery or rediscovery, because it was not completely hidden, of Buddhist thought. One point on which Buddhism can contribute most to science is to remove certain false enigmas. And I will speak to you several times of the famous hard problem of the origin of consciousness. Okay, some scientists would say, oh, well, we already know consciousness is produced by the brain. When they are asked precisely what they mean by consciousness is produced by the brain, they say, okay, we inhibit the working of the brain and the people don't speak anymore. They don't express themselves. And they are lying as dead people, closing their eyes and so on. Therefore, they are not conscious. And therefore, the consciousness was produced by the brain, that is switch off, switch on. This is the most rough argument, of course, but other arguments are much more subtle, were used with precise knowledge of the functioning of the brain during speech, during memorization, and so on. And many arguments are given in favor of production of consciousness by the brain. But the only thing that we really know for sure is that there is correlation between the first-person reports of subjects and the patterns that are observed in the brain. Correlation between the two. As William James has said many years ago, 100 years ago, this correlation can be indeed explained in terms of causality, namely, brain causes consciousness, but it can be explained in many other ways. For instance, brain triggers or modulates consciousness. That is just there, and the brain makes a modulation of it, or it triggers it, or whatever, or it transmits it, whatever. So the idea that correlation means causality, as you know, is not correct. The correlation between verbal reports and brain patterns doesn't mean that the brain patterns are the cause of the consciousness that is expressed by these reports. Now, true, there is an argument that is often given by the people who are pushed, well, I mean, by the scientists who are pushed in this direction, is that you can trigger experiences, special experiences, by stimulating regions of the brain. True. And in the common definition of consciousness, when you can act on something and trigger an effect, then this is a cause. Okay? This is true. But the converse is true also. Namely, if you modify your state of mind, you can modify your brain. So here again, there are two directions of connection, not one. And also, you will see, the really hard problem of consciousness is not to show that acting on the patterns of the brain can modify patterns of first-person experience as reported verbally, but how is it that lived experience comes at all? It's not the modulation that is at stake here. It's the fact that there is experience rather than nothing. As David Chalmers said in his book about consciousness, there are a lot of so-called easy problems of the connection between brain and consciousness. The easy problems are about the functions of the brain regions and the functions that are ascribed to consciousness. For instance, reflectivity. I know that I'm knowing. I know that I'm speaking. Here is the function of consciousness. Also, the function of making a synthesis between the various workings of the mind in a single act of consciousness. Good. But what about the hard problem? Not the easy problems of the functions, but the hard problem of the presence of this experience. Okay? We don't know. And no serious neurologist, when pushed very far in this direction, will normally say that we know already the origin of consciousness. In this sense, in the sense of lived experience, not in the sense of functions such as reflectivity or power of synthesis. Okay. And Buddhism can bring a lot in this debate. Why? Because a Buddhist could notice that Western civilization became so enticed by the objective targets of their technologies that they overlooked the fact that every research originates in human minds and consciousness. Consciousness is the departure point of everything, including of the conviction that the brain could be the origin of consciousness. Okay. So this is absolutely obvious, but so obvious that no one seems to pay attention to this. And I remember a friend recently told me something about the teaching of a famous Tibetan master who said, "This is so obvious that you will not believe it. This is so simple that you will not understand." And I think the fact that an act of consciousness comes before anything, including the conviction that the brain is the origin of consciousness, is one of these facts that is too simple to be believed. Okay? But fortunately, some philosophers in the West were aware of this problem. And Edmund Husserl, whom I will expound very much more at length tomorrow, had understood that. According to Husserl, this forgetfulness, this oblivion of the primacy of consciousness triggered what he called the crisis of European sciences. European science, namely Western science, is both amazingly successful but full of difficulties and paradoxes. One of them is the hard problem of consciousness. Another one is the measurement problem, the cat paradox in quantum physics, and so on and so on. All these paradoxes completely disappear as soon as you understand that the whole inquiry starts with an act of consciousness. So by engaging with Buddhism, researchers gain a first-hand contemplative approach to consciousness, which enables them to overturn the ill-posed problem of its material origin. When they realize that every problem they ask is asked in an act of consciousness, then they understand that the problem was ill-posed. By the way, I can tell you my own story on this point, because it illustrates what I'm saying. I was in 2008 to a summer school of mind and life in Garrison, New York. And there was a harsh debate about consciousness. Even Buddhist scientists sometimes are very reductionist. And I was trying to argue with them, to convince them, and so on. And they tried to convince me, of course. And we didn't reach any conclusion. Arguments were equal. They could not really convince each other. And then, fortunately, there was one day of meditation, one day complete silence meditation, only one day. And I must say, for the whole session of the morning, my mind was extremely buzzing, active, and I was thinking of these arguments again and again and again. You know, argument for and against reductionism and so on. I was meditating, but quite poorly. And then there was the afternoon. And at the middle of the afternoon, when Barry Kersin, maybe you know him, offered us to practice open presence, suddenly I saw, all this buzzing of the mind as buzzing of the mind and nothing more. And what was beyond this buzzing of the mind, or below this buzzing of the mind, was the pure awareness. Awareness that there were these activities of the mind. And suddenly I jumped during the meditation and say, that's it, that's the solution. The solution is not an intellectual solution, it's realization. Realization that consciousness is there before any question is raised, and that questions, discussions, arguments, intellectual activities are all swimming in an ocean of consciousness. So this is how I convinced myself, not by an argument, but rather by an experience. So I think that benefit of Buddhism can be that, not arguments, not only arguments, but also doing the best we can of practice. So I said there are differences, there are common features between science and Buddhism. There are complementarities, namely mutual benefit. And there are also differences. For instance, clear that the empirical data of Buddhist knowledge are, I would call them experiential. They are experiences, lived experiences. The experiences that are lived, especially in contemplative states, when people meditate. Whereas in science, they are experimental. A scientist, I told you yesterday that one of the major steps in science was to accept that the material that is used in order to test theories is not mere observation, but it's canalized, channeled observations by experiments. So this is very different. Of course, there can be sort of experiences in Buddhism also, because you can, for instance, do various kinds of practices and try the differences between the various kind of practices. But the final tribunal to that is lived experience of practitioners. Okay. So another difference, and I also already alluded to it yesterday, is that Buddhist epistemology tends to deconstruct conceptual generalizations and permanent objects, substances, while sticking to the experiential instantaneous particulars called kshanika. Okay, so for a Buddhist, the more you come close to the present, the more you come close to the vividness of the present moment of experience, the more you come close to reality. Okay? Instead, scientific knowledge is exactly the opposite. The more you come to general categories, stable entities, unified models of mathematics, and so on, that are, so to speak, extremes of abstraction, the more you believe you are close to reality. So it's really completely different. So according to a modern physicist, reality is depicted by the unified, by the so-called theory of ground unification, or by the theory of superstrings and so on. And when you see what it is, when you see superstrings, it's a monument of abstraction. How can this be reality? That's a problem. According to Buddhist epistemology, so conceptual superimpositions yield conventional knowledge, the knowledge that is used in practice. It's useful to have concepts, to be sure, because, when you want to act, you want to use your past experience. And in order to use your past experience, you need to make similarities. For instance, the past time I saw a certain shape, I jumped on this shape, and the shape was running for me. Now I see a similar shape, and I know I can jump on it, and it will run for me. How can I do that? By the concept of a horse. A horse is the concept that is common to the shape yesterday and to the shape today. The shape of an animal that is capable of running and with me on it. Okay? Concepts are useful, but are concepts more real than individuals? That's, some people in the West would say yes, because they are influenced by Plato. But, and some people in the West would say no, because they are influenced by the so-called nominalists, the people in the Middle Ages who followed the doctrines of William of Ockham and so on, who said only individuals are real, concepts are just names. That's the reason why he was called nominalist. So, and for Buddhists, it's clear that Buddhists would side very clearly on the side of nominalists. They would say, okay, we have instantaneous particulars, and we superimpose classes and concepts on them. Okay? And so they are only superimpositions. And they have practical function, but no more than that. Instead, here again, the dream of illusion of science is that conceptual mathematical structure discloses the ultimate nature of reality. So here again, there is a very deep difference in the directions. Another difference, it's about time. What to do with time? What to do with impermanence? Well, one strategy is just recognize it. And I think it's basically the Buddhist strategy. Accept impermanence. The other solution is try to stop something, to stop the flow of changes, either by concepts or by technologies, or both. Okay? Okay. Stopping the flow of time by concepts is saying, okay, we don't want to say that, just things appear, then disappear, then reappears, and so on. We want to say that there is something common to these appearances and disappearances. This something in common is a permanent solid substance. We stop time like that, okay, to a certain extent. Also, technology can try to stop time. You know, one of these technologies is that what we are using now. For instance, photography, taking picture, tries to stop time. There was something, transient, and suddenly it captured in a picture, and the picture you can see again and again and again. It's very interesting to see that, one of the types of cameras sold by a Japanese industry is called Nikon. Nikon, you certainly know the name of the cameras, Nikon. Nikon means an instant, the present, now in Japanese. Okay? So that means that the camera tries to capture now and make it stay sometime, not always, of course. Other difference. The Buddhist project is complete cessation of suffering by uprooting its existential cause. What is the existential cause of suffering? Well, maybe, I'm sure you know more than I do, but I think that one of the sources of suffering, according to Buddhism, is clinging on the ego as a permanent being. And also not recognizing impermanence, trying to capture, trying to grasp, trying to stop what cannot be stopped. It can be two sources of suffering. So, the Buddhist project is to go directly to these sources of suffering. By contrast, medical research contents itself with alleviating suffering by fighting the symptoms and the physical bodily causes. So instead of, for instance, depression can be a symptom of someone who doesn't want to accept impermanence. It's very clear, because when you lose someone dear to you, when you lose something that was precious to you, then you suffer innerly, you are depressed, and so on. So how to cure that? Either you try to work in order to recognize, accept, and integrate the impermanence in your own life, or you give a pill, an antidepressive pill, and then you have an improvement. But only transient improvement. Even the improvement is impermanent, by the way. So, also difference of orientation. Difference of orientation, well, Buddhist, when you practice meditation, you do, and you will see how connected it is to phenomenology, this philosophical discipline invented by Edmund Husserl. What you practice is suspension of judgment. You try to suspend all these conceptual superimpositions and to deposit yourself in the present experience, the present evidence. You become neutral. You don't judge everything. You become mindful but not judging. And when you practice intellectual activity, obviously many Buddhist practitioners are also remarkable thinkers, they think a lot, they perform a lot of intellectual activity. For instance, I think of Tsongkhapa, one of my favorite authors. But this intellectual activity is not meant, here again, to find a concept that would stop the impermanence of things. It's aimed at discriminating between the sound and unsound ways to advance on the path of liberation. For instance, what I found in Tsongkhapa is that the proper use of concepts is to deconstruct concepts. He said, he gives the analogy of two stones that are, here the English word is missing, but when you try to strike one stone towards another stone, then you produce a spark. Okay, so it's the same according to Tsongkhapa for concepts. You exert a concept against another concept, and then it produces a spark. What is the spark? The realization of the emptiness of beings and the realization of the purely practical status of these concepts. When you have that, then you have done a step on the path of liberation. So the use of concepts is to advance on the path of liberation. It's not to try to stop impermanence. Okay, now, scientific methodology is completely different. It's judgmental from its experimental work to its intellectual product. Judgments are everywhere. And especially, I told you yesterday that even facts are full of theory. Even facts, scientific facts, are full of interpretation. So judgment is present even in what is compared with theory, namely facts. Of course, scientists should know that. They should know that their judgments are only judgments, that their judgments are hypotheses, that these hypotheses have to be compared with values of experiments in order to be corroborated or in order to be refuted. So they should know the purely hypothetical status of their judgments. But in practice, as soon as they have been proved to be successful, scientific theories are taught as if they were well-entrenched knowledge. So sometimes, of course, this is a fact of teaching, teaching science. How can you teach science? Do you teach that science as the true story of the world? Or do you teach science as something that has to be tested? There are two ways of teaching science. And I'm afraid when I've seen the evolution of the teaching of science in my country, in France, and I've seen that, unfortunately, things are going more and more towards dogmatic and less towards critical and experimental. Namely, probably because, we don't have time to do so much, and then we tell a story. We say, science says that electrons have a charge, but how do you know that? Do you know what is the experiment that shows that? And what is the interpretation that comes on top of the experiment to draw this sentence, this very simple sentence, namely, the electron has an electric charge? Okay, what is I would say, the sandwich of experiment plus interpretation that allows us to make this statement? So I think, yes, if I had a wish, it would be to make a critical evaluative, experimental teaching of science rather than a dogmatic teaching of science. And I've seen that in some Tibetan schools, for instance, I've been in Selakui in the secondary school of the TCV, last secondary school, and I've seen with good surprise that it was indeed the case here. Namely that the students were asked to make themselves the experiment, to build the apparatus, to understand what they were doing, not just tell a tale about the world, you know. And by the way, you have understood that to me, the best part of science is precisely this one, the critical, the factor of testing, of inquiring, of doubting, and so on, rather than the dogmatic part, the story. The story is very, well, you believe it or you don't believe it, but the critical part is wonderful. So there is also a difference of orientation between the two types of knowledge. I characterize that by two terms. Knowledge by distanciation, taking distance with respect to what you want to know, or knowledge by resonance, by empathy, by coming within what you want to know. So knowledge by distanciation means that you define an object of knowledge, object that is far away from you. Knowledge by resonance means that you become non-dual with what you want to know. By the way, knowledge by resonance is an expression that was recently invented by a German philosopher called Hartmut Rosa. And Hartmut Rosa wrote a book called Resonance, in which he documents this kind of knowledge, which is so different from the objective kind of knowledge. So let's compare the two. In knowledge by distanciation, you want to examine things. You examine, you see, okay? You examine also other beings. For instance, if you are a surgeon, you examine your patient with your eyes, saying, "Oh, I will cut it and remove something wrong in it." In knowledge by resonance, you respond to the other. You enter into resonance. You empathize with the other. In knowledge by distanciation, you strive to reach what you want to know. You make literally this movement, the hand that tries to grasp something, or the eye that stares at something and aims at something. In knowledge by resonance, you let it come. You suspend judgments and you rest in your natural state, if possible. Okay, I can say a lot of things about that, but I love this, this interesting coincidence, actually, of etymologies in French. In French, the word knowledge is said connaissance. But Paul Claudel, a French poet, have said that the right way to know things is connaissance, not connaissance, connaissance. What is the difference? Connaissance in French means to be born with, to be born together with. Okay? And so the difference is that between knowledge by distanciation and knowledge with something with which you are born, with which you are in dependent arising, in fact. So these two orientations of knowledge, I think, are typical of the difference between science and Buddhism. One tries to capture objects in the network of concepts. The other one wants to coincide, to deposit oneself within what is to be known. Okay? So these two types of knowledge cannot be completely mixed up. Okay, so I think I will stop at this point. I give you an example of differences between, I would say, the Western scientific attitude and the Buddhist attitude towards the same problem, exactly the same problem. I recently discovered that there was the same problem in Dharmakirti as a problem that is called in Western philosophy the Gettier Problem. In fact, this so-called, it was called Gettier Problem because it was a philosopher called Gettier in 1960s who first posed this problem. So what is the problem? The problem comes from Plato, Plato's Theaetetus. I advise some of you, especially the students of Buddhist philosophy and especially Buddhist epistemology, Dharmakirti, should read the Theaetetus of Plato because they can compare. It's the basis for Western epistemology. So, in this dialogue, Theaetetus, Plato gives three definitions of knowledge successively. Namely, in fact, you know that Plato's books are dialogues. There is one guy and Socrates, usually, as the second guy. And they discuss, they do debates, like a little bit like Tibetan monks. And Socrates, I don't know the English pronunciation of Socrates. I think Socrates, yes. Socrates asks the guy, what is knowledge according to you? And the guy answers, first answer, sensation. Knowledge is sensation. When I sense something, I know that thing. Good. But then he said, look, there is a pond here in front of you. What is this pond? Oh, he said, oh yes, a pond. And suddenly Socrates said, no, it's not a pond, it's just a mirage. It's just reflection of light. So clearly, when you have just sensation and the wrong judgment, you don't have knowledge. So Socrates asks the guy, now that you understood that, what is true? What is knowledge? And the guy said, okay, you're right. It's not sensation. It's true judgment. True judgment. Valid judgment, you would say. And Socrates moves the head and says, maybe, but I can give you a counterexample once again. And the counterexample is a true judgment can be reached by mistake or by chance. Is a true judgment obtained by mistake or by chance knowledge or just invention? And the guy said, oh yes, I'm sorry, yes, it's not enough to have a true judgment. It's necessary to have a true justified judgment. Namely, you have to have a justification of the judgment in order for the true judgment to count as knowledge. But then, okay, then the dialogue of Plato stops at this point. We have reached maybe a conclusion that knowledge is true justified judgment. Okay? But Gettier, 2,000 years after, noticed that even justification can be wrong. Even justification can be weak and can be falsified. And truth thus can be reached at random or for wrong reasons. Even though you can give reasons for your true judgment, the reasons can be wrong. Is it knowledge when you have true justified judgment, but the justification is wrong? This is called the Gettier Problem. So an example. I see a building at a distance. It looks like a barn, and I judge on this basis that this building is a barn. So there is sensation, there is judgment, and there is justification. It looks like a barn, therefore it's a barn. I come closer to it, and I see that this is a barn indeed. Okay, so you say, okay, judgment based on sensation, justified, and it comes true. So it's knowledge, isn't it? Gettier said, beware, beware. Because, in fact, the justification was not completely, compelling. Indeed, in this region, farmers disguise their houses as barns to escape the housing tax. So, my judgment that this was a barn could have been wrong just as well, because every house in this region looks like a barn. The fact that it is indeed a barn, and therefore the judgment and the statement was true, is not compelling. And therefore, is it knowledge? So you see Gettier problem. Okay. And this Gettier problem has triggered an amazing lot of literature in philosophy journals in recent years. And people are embarrassed. They say, oh, we cannot define knowledge. How terrible, because we want knowledge to be something strong, definitive, well-founded, and so on and so on. We want certainty, and we can't have certainty. And so we are a little bit bothered and puzzled. Now, Dharmakirti had exactly the same problem. He found it more than 1,000 years before Gettier, and he drew completely different conclusions. The example of Dharmakirti is this one. A diamond is wrapped in a silk fabric. The silk emits a reflection, light, that makes me judge from far away that there is indeed a diamond here. But the judgment that there is a diamond is based on the glittering of the silk, not of the glittering of the diamond. Therefore, I have reached the truth for a bad reason. Is it knowledge or is it not knowledge? Dharmakirti doesn't raise this question. He raised rather the general question of the value of knowledge. What is knowledge, after all, according to Dharmakirti? He considered that all kind of knowledge reached by this way, namely by sensation and inference, to be just conventional knowledge, nothing more. So he knows that knowledge, this kind of knowledge, cannot be something strong, certain, and so on. And so he said, okay, this is just conventional knowledge. It's very useful in our lives. It can have good consequences, but it's just conventional. And now that we know it's just conventional, let's try to go to the ultimate. Okay? So that's completely different. From a Western point of view, this kind of knowledge, namely sensation plus inference, should be absolutely certain and reach something ultimate. And when you see that it's not the case, you are embarrassed. You say, oh, that's a problem. How can you do that? It's a paradox. We have to work on it. We have to write more philosophy papers, and so on and so on. Dharmakirti, no problem. I know it's just practical knowledge, just conventional knowledge. And I don't care. That's the difference, you know. So, there is a risk of hegemony, as I told you, from the two sides. But in view of the historical situation we are in, the risk of hegemony of science over Buddhism is much more problematic than the other way around. Okay? For instance, many cognitive neuroscientists have a project to disclose the biological basis of meditation by a neuroscientific approach. Look, this word, this expression, neural basis or biological basis, is used in every journal of neurology. But obviously, it also carries a vision of the world with it. Biological basis, neural basis. That means the vision of the world it carries is the vision of the world in which you have elements, things that are really fundamental, say the elementary particles, and things that are just a byproduct of it. So the basis is the most fundamental beings in the world, which some take to be elementary particles, and all the rest is derivative. Okay? So, and therefore, when they speak of finding the biological basis of meditation, they mean to find something more fundamental, more real than the experience that is reached in meditation, and that explains the experience of meditation. So in this case, if you follow the logic to its very far end, you conclude that meditation is just a biological event in the brain. It has no significance other than this one. Well, we'll discuss about how it's possible to argue against this argument. But now, so this comes, as I told you, from a cultural bias called naturalism. Bracket mind and culture in favor of matter, seen as the exclusive constituent of nature. There is an argument that has been given long ago, once again by Edmund Husserl, whom I will expound tomorrow, against that. He said, okay, you believe, for instance, that the brain is the producer of consciousness, the producer of thought, and so on and so on. Therefore, your thought that the brain produces thought is just a brain event. Can you ascribe truth to a brain event? No, it's just an event. It just happens to be here. It has no truth value. And therefore, your thought that the brain is the source of thought has no truth value. It's neither true nor false. Okay, so you see how these things can be, reversed. Now I'll show you something different. You examine biological evolution, and you try to know when consciousness emerged from the so-called biological basis. And you will see that things are not obvious at all, even though many scientists would say, oh yes, consciousness emerged when there was enough complexity of the brain, or consciousness emerges when there was integrated information muddled by the brain, or consciousness emerged when there was global neural area in which all the information is gathered from various parts of the brain, and so on and so on. Okay, so they say that. And then one asks, okay, but at what point of biological evolution did this occur? At what point of biological evolution did consciousness emerge from this biological basis? And then you see the literature, and you see as many answers as there are authors. For instance, I take 3 examples. When consciousness is defined as reflection about a unified self, so it's a very high level kind of consciousness, then according to James in 1976, only human beings have this kind of consciousness. And even worse, only human beings after or during the Neolithic era. Before that, prehistoric men, human beings, didn't have consciousness in this sense. Okay? So it's extreme. It's probably the most, I would say, anthropomorphic or human-like answer to the question, when did consciousness emerge in the biological evolution? According to James, a pre-Neolithic human being didn't have consciousness in the sense of a unified self on which there is reflection. And he bases his remark on some observations. For instance, that human beings before the Neolithic Revolution often heard voices as a schizophrenic person. And these voices were testimony, witness that that was not any unification of that personality into a fabricated self. That they themselves considered themselves as a multiplicity of persons. Okay, so here is an argument. But this idea that only human beings during the Neolithic era have consciousness comes from a very elaborated definition of consciousness. Now, you can go to a less elaborate definition of consciousness, namely reflection, not about a unified self, just reflection about experienced events. In this case, some authors say that mammals, every mammals, even mice and elephants and so on, have consciousness, and birds, most birds have consciousness. You know that there is this experiment, which is a little bit intermediate between the two forms of consciousness I've alluded to. This experiment in which you put a mirror in front of an animal, and some animals would go towards the image in the mirror because they believe that it's someone else. But other animals don't do that, and so they realize that this is the reflection of themselves. Okay, so clearly there are criteria to ascribe consciousness in this sense to birds, to some birds, and to apes also. But consciousness can be defined as something much more primitive, much more elementary. For instance, concern, just concern. Being concerned by something that happens and may have consequence for my life. Just that. Not reflecting, not thinking about myself as a person, and so on. Just, I'm threatened, I'm afraid, or I'm attracted, just that. Fear or attraction. In that case, for instance, Francisco Varela said, in that sense, even bacteria are conscious because they are attracted towards food and repelled by threats. They have concern. And what about something even more elementary than concern? Because concern is still a sort of focusing of mind towards some target, a threat or food. What about pure experience? Sentience? Nothing more. So where did sentience emerge? Big question. We don't know. And we have no idea of the answer. When did sentience emerge? Okay? Okay, now let's go to the reasonings people do when they inquire about the origin of an organ or the origin of a biological function during evolution. the mechanism for the on-rise of an organ or function is twofold. First, there is random appearance of features, because you know there are spontaneous mutation of DNA and genes, and therefore this spontaneous mutation can trigger the appearance of a feature just by chance. But then, after this feature has appeared by chance, there is selection of the fittest. Only if the new character is detrimental to the life of the organism will disappear, and this organ will not be retained by evolution. And conversely, if the new adaptation, if the new feature or the new organ is adaptative rather than detrimental, then the organism that has it will have more possibilities to reproduce, and since it is reproduced, it will become dominant in the population, and therefore it will really be stabilized. Now, okay, so this works for organs and functions. Now, can we ask the same question for experience? How did experience appear during the evolution? Okay, maybe there was random appearance of this feature. But what about selection? Can the presence or absence of experience, can it be selected by anything? The only thing that can be selected by the environment is a behavior. An organism behaves in an efficient way to get food and to avoid threats. Therefore, it is selected. But what about experience? It doesn't trigger a new behavior. It's just that behavior no longer goes unnoticed. Someone feels what it is like to have this behavior. But that's it. It doesn't change the behavior by itself. Behavior remains what it was. So it's impossible, in fact, to think that experience was selected by evolution, because evolution is simply indifferent to it. So, since it is the case, there are two options about the origin of experience in evolution. Either pure experience is beginningless, namely it has always been there. It's a feature of what there is. Experience is there. Or pure experience is just an epiphenomenon of behavioral functions. Namely, it appears, it may appear, but it was not necessary at all. And at any rate, it's not either selected or unselected. It has no selective value by itself. So, what I want to show here is that the option according to which experience, pure experience, is beginningless is not excluded by the theory of evolution. Is not excluded. Okay. So the idea that consciousness has no beginning and no end, which is a common idea in Buddhism, I would say is not confirmed by science, but it's not excluded by science. So it's important to know that it's not excluded by science, because some people could tell you, yes, it is excluded by science. We know that consciousness emerges only when there are complex brains. But what emerges when there are complex brains is not the elementary part of consciousness. It's the elaborate part of consciousness, which is reflectivity, nothing more. So I think it's very important to know that. So what status can be ascribed to science in a Buddhist cultural framework? We have seen what science can say about Buddhism, namely it can take it as an object of study and tries to elucidate the so-called neural basis of meditation, and so on and so on. But, you know, the opposite can be interesting also. What can a Buddhist say about science? I remember having attended here again a summer school of mind and life, and witnessed a debate between a scientist and a Buddhist geshe. And the scientist was saying, science has proved that consciousness is produced by the brain, and therefore meditation is just an event in the brain. And the geshe was skeptical, and he said, yes, but for us, you know, what you call science is part of conventional knowledge. He alluded to the doctrine of two truths. In Nagarjuna you find this sentence: the Buddha's teaching of the Dharma is based on two truths, a truth of worldly convention and an ultimate truth. So, since science is essentially a practical truth of worldly convention, it cannot be said an ultimate truth. So you cannot say that your proposition according to which the brain produces consciousness is more than a piece of conventional knowledge. That means that it has practical value in some situations. So this idea that the belief that consciousness is produced by the brain can have a practical value was confirmed to me by a neurobiologist. A neurobiologist who worked with Giulio Tononi. I asked him, we were debating as ever about this famous issue of the origin or non-origin of consciousness. And I pushed him quite far. He was very honest. He finally said, yes, I agree. We know nothing about pure experience. We cannot do anything to prove that pure experience comes from a certain working of such and such part of the brain. But, he added, I have to have this belief in my background because it works as an incentive for me to go on in research and to progress for the sake of medicine. When, for instance, I want to know whether someone is in a state of coma or not, when I want to know whether someone is conscious even though he or she is lying on the bed, I have to think that I know what consciousness is and where it comes from in the brain. So for me, this belief is an incentive to go further in my criteria of discrimination between the people who are conscious and the people who are not conscious when they are apparently inert and in coma. And I must say, I was impressed by his reply, because finally one revealed what was the real status of this kind of statement. The brain produces consciousness. It's just that it's a way to say, I can learn more about the state of consciousness of people in coma. Okay. So I said, yes, I understand, and I think the purpose of his belief was, I would say, compassionate. So it's interesting. But beyond that, what is most important to understand is that it's only that. It's a practical judgment. It's not a theoretical judgment that says something about the ultimate nature of the world, that the ultimate nature of the world is purely material and all the rest is derivative. Okay? So one must be careful about the status of such statement. So at the end of the day, we can think of this sentence by the Japanese philosopher Nishida Kitaro, the world of science is not the world of the true reality. The truth reached by science is merely conventional and practical. And there are philosophy of science in the West also that would agree with that. They are called pragmatism, William James, Charles Sanders Peirce, and so on, and instrumentalism, for instance, Bridgman, even Einstein to a certain extent was instrumentalist. So it's clear that seeing science this way removes nothing from its capacities and can make us more lucid. So now we are maybe a little bit clearer about the similarities, complementarities, and differences between science and Buddhism, and we can see also the motivations for a dialogue between the two disciplines. Even though they are different, even though one has the temptation of swallow the other in its own system, the two can have a strong motivation for a dialogue. First motivation is clearly the motivation of Buddhism, namely alleviate suffering. And His Holiness always insists on this motivation. He said, if we can alleviate suffering even a little bit by making science collaborate with Buddhism, it's good. And we have to go further in this direction. And science can really take advantage of, for instance, the cultivation by Buddhism of states of consciousness that are stable and focused. Because then, with this kind of states of consciousness that are stable and focused, we can see much more clearly the brain correlates of these states of consciousness. Instead, when there is agitation of the mind, it's quite difficult to pick certain regions of the brain that are working at that moment because they are always changing. An advantage for Buddhism also, as I told you, is to confront the worldview of modernity. To say, what is Buddhism in the modern world? Is it just a mode of cultivation of brain states, or is it much more than that? Okay? So it's very important that these questions are raised, even from a Buddhist standpoint. For science, the advantage of having the dialogue with Buddhism could be to compensate with what I call the blind spot of scientific worldview. What is the blind spot of scientific worldview? You know maybe the blind spot of the eye. The blind spot of the eye is this point of the retina that cannot see anything. Okay? But even more interesting is to quote Wittgenstein in the Tractatus when he said, the eye cannot be seen in the visual field. Okay? So the eye is the blindfold spot of vision because the eye doesn't see itself. Okay? Maybe you can see the eye in the mirror, but not in the visual field. Okay? So what plays the role of the eye that doesn't see itself in science? What plays the role of the eye that doesn't see itself in science is consciousness. All the scientists are conscious, sentient human beings who study something by way of their experimental apparatuses, but they always forget that at the end of the process, there is an act of consciousness. There is the act of consciousness that says, oh, I see this result. Or the act of consciousness that says, I've organized this theory, it looks plausible. It looks plausible. I feel it plausible. And then you compare the theory and the phenomenon, and you say, oh, it fits. I'm happy because it fits. Here again, a state of consciousness, okay? But you always forget that, and therefore, since you forget that every act of knowledge is an act of consciousness, you want to derive consciousness from knowledge. And it's completely circular, and it cannot work. Okay, and so here it's a summary, in fact. It's a summary of my whole talk. The similarity between Buddhism and science is you remain faithful to empirical data and you use reasoning to draw warranted conclusions from them. And there are differences also because you have, in Buddhism, the aim is cessation of sufferance by uprooting its existential cause. Instead, science, you want to fight symptoms and physical causes of suffering. Okay, you see here a whole table that recapitulates the similarities and differences. So I think now I can stop and let